The Bavarian winter of 1922 did not just bring the cold, it brought a silence so heavy it felt predatory. Deep within the woods of Upper Bavaria, 70 kilometers north of Munich, sat Hinterkaifeck, a farmstead that existed as a world unto itself. It was a place of jagged edges and sour soil, a cluster of timber and stone held together by the grim persistence of the Gruber family. But as March approached, the air around the farm didn't just chill the skin, it curdled the spirit. Andreas Gruber, a man of 63, was not a person built for fear. He was a man of iron and resentment, a patriarch whose reputation in the village of Kaifeck was stained by rumors of cruelty and an incestuous darkness that clung to his daughter, Victoria. Yet, in those final days, even Andreas's iron resolve began to rust. The dread began not with a scream, but with a footprint. One morning, following a light dusting of snow that had transformed the Bavarian landscape into a pristine white shroud, Andreas stepped out onto the porch. His eyes, hardened by decades of joyless labor, caught a distortion in the purity of the field. Leading from the dense, dark edge of the forest toward the homestead were tracks. Boots. Deep, purposeful indentations in the snow. Andreas tracked them with a mounting sense of intrusion. They led directly to the back door of the machine house. But as he turned to see where they led back to the forest, his blood ran cold. There were no departing tracks. Someone had walked out of the woods, approached his home, and never left. The farmstead was a labyrinth of shadows. The architecture of Hinterkaifeck was typical of the era, a closed courtyard system where the living quarters were directly connected to the stables and the barn. You could move from the kitchen to the cow stalls without ever stepping outside. It was a design meant for convenience, but it became a blueprint for a nightmare. It meant that whatever had entered the farm was now part of the internal ecosystem of the house. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of stale rye, livestock, and a simmering unspoken tension. Victoria, a widow with a voice that once sang in the church choir but had since withered into a weary rasp, felt the change first. It was the sound of the house breathing when it should have been still. In the dead of night, as the wind howled through the rafters, a different sound began to emerge from the attic, a rhythmic, heavy thudding. It wasn't the skittering of rats or the settling of old timber. It was the unmistakable gait of a human being pacing directly above their heads. Andreas, armed with a rusted rifle and a pride that refused to call for help, searched the property. He checked the haylofts, the tool sheds, and the dark corners of the barn. He found nothing, but the farm was gaslighting him. The next morning, a newspaper appeared on the porch, the Munich Neueste Nachrichten. It was crisp, folded neatly, and utterly alien. No one in the household subscribed to it. The postman hadn't delivered it. It was a gift from a ghost, a sign that the intruder wasn't just hiding, he was watching, reading, and waiting. The psychological erosion of the family was profound. Kazelia, the 72-year-old matriarch, retreated into a shell of prayer and paranoia. Little 7-year-old Kazelia and 2-year-old Joseph were shielded by the thick walls, but children have a way of sensing the vibration of fear in their parents. The atmosphere was a thick soup of dread. Every creak of the floorboard was a heartbeat. Every flicker of the oil lamp was a shadow reaching out. Then came the final omen. Andreas discovered that the keys to the tool shed, heavy iron keys that never left their hook, had vanished. At the same time, someone had attempted to tamper with the lock on the motorized forest house. It was a methodical stripping away of the family's security. The intruder was disarming the fortress piece by piece. Even the previous maid had fled months earlier, claiming the house was haunted, that the very walls were possessed by a malevolent force. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, was scheduled to arrive on the afternoon of March 31st. She walked into a house that was already a tomb, though the bodies were still walking. She was a stranger, entering a climax of a horror story she didn't know had started. As the sun began to dip below the horizon on that final Friday, the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. The cattle in the stalls were restless, lowing in a frequency that suggested they could smell something the humans couldn't. The isolation of Hinterkaifeck was now total. The nearest neighbor was too far to hear a scream, and the woods were too thick to see a fire. The stage was set. The unseen entity in the attic stopped pacing. The floorboards above the kitchen gave one final, agonizing groan. The last flicker of daylight surrendered to an oppressive darkness on Friday, March 31st, 1922. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, had arrived that afternoon, her presence a fleeting whisper of normalcy in a house already consumed by an invisible dread. Unaware of the chilling prelude of footsteps and phantom newspapers, she began her duties, perhaps noting the unusual quiet of the Gruber household, the strained expressions of Victoria, or the perpetual scowl of Andreas. The evening meal would have been a somber affair, punctuated only by the clinking of cutlery and the distant lowing of cattle. A familiar rhythm of farm life that would soon be brutally silenced. As night deepened, a profound, unnatural quiet descended upon Hinterkaifeck. The usual symphony of a working farm, the rustle of hay, the shifting of animals, the creak of timber settling, seemed to hold its breath. It was a silence that felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the very air had thickened with anticipation. Inside the farmhouse, the oil lamps cast long, dancing shadows, turning familiar corners into monstrous shapes. Each member of the Gruber family retired to their beds, carrying their individual burdens. Andreas, the patriarch, his gruff exterior perhaps finally cracked by the relentless, unsettling occurrences. Cecilia, the elderly matriarch, her rosary clutched tight, seeking solace from a terror she couldn't name. Victoria, burdened by the whispers of the village and the oppressive weight of her father's presence. Little Cecilia and Joseph, their innocent dreams likely disturbed by the unspoken anxieties that permeated their home. Then the attack began. It was swift, brutal, and meticulously executed. The killer or killers knew the layout of the farm, moving with an eerie precision through the connecting passages. The first victim was likely Andreas Gruber, perhaps lured into the barn by a subtle disturbance or ambushed as he tended to the animals before his final sleep. The murder weapon, a mattock, fell with savage force, splitting bone and silencing his formidable will. The smell of fresh blood, metallic and sickening, would have mingled with the earthy scent of hay and manure, a grim testament to the horrific act. Next, it was Cecilia, the matriarch, struck down with similar brutality. Her prayers unanswered, her quiet dignity shattered in an instant. Then Victoria, her life already a tapestry of sorrow, met her end with the same unsparing violence. Little 7-year-old Cecilia, a child whose laughter should have filled the farm, was also cut down. It's theorized she was struck in her bed, her small body defenseless against such a monstrous assault. Finally, the newly arrived maid, Maria Baumgartner, was murdered in her room. A tragic victim of circumstance, her short stay at Hinterkaifeck ending in a nightmare she could never have foreseen. And chillingly, the toddler, Joseph, was killed in his cradle, a horrifying act of pure, unadulterated evil. 6 lives extinguished, not in a chaotic frenzy, but with a terrifying, almost ritualistic efficiency. The air, once thick with unspoken dread, now hung heavy with the stench of death. For days, an unsettling quiet hung over Hinterkaifeck. The smoke from the chimney, usually a steadfast plume against the Bavarian sky, ceased. The farm animals, untended, grew restless, their cries echoing in the unnerving stillness. Neighbors, accustomed to the reclusive nature of the Grubers, initially thought little of the silence, but then the mail began to pile up. The younger Cecilia missed school. On Tuesday, April 4th, the mechanist Albert Hofner, who had been contracted to repair an engine at the farm, arrived. He noticed the smoke was not rising from the chimney. He called out, his voice swallowed by the unnerving quiet. A profound sense of unease, a prickling sensation on his skin, told him something was terribly wrong. He cautiously walked around the house, pushing open a gate, peering into the stables. He saw no one, but the main door was ajar. Hoffner's fear propelled him back to the village. He gathered a small group, his sons and the local postman, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a man whose own life was inextricably linked to Victoria Gruber. He was the father of little Josef. Together they returned to Hinterkaifeck. The silence that greeted them was deeper, more absolute than before. Hoffner approached the barn door, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He pushed it open. The scene that unfolded was a tableau of unspeakable horror. In the barn, amidst the hay and the muted lowing of the abandoned cattle, lay the first three bodies: Andreas, Cecilia Sr. and Victoria. Their faces, distorted by rigor mortis and the brutal blows, were frozen in expressions of terror and agony. The mattock, still stained with blood and hair, lay nearby. The air in the barn was cold, stagnant, and thick with the cloying odor of death, mingled with the earthy smell of the stables. As they moved into the farmhouse, the horror deepened. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, lay in her bed, a grotesque testament to her brief, ill-fated employment. In another room, the small, innocent body of 7-year-old Cecilia was discovered, a stark contrast to the adult brutality surrounding her. And finally, the most gut-wrenching discovery: little Joseph, a mere 2 years old, found dead in his cradle, a life extinguished before it had truly begun. The sheer savagery, the cold-blooded efficiency of the murders sent a shockwave through the small group. What followed was a macabre investigation. The initial response was chaotic, hampered by the primitive forensic techniques of the era. The bodies remained largely untouched for a full day before a proper investigation began. The villagers, many of whom had held grudges against Andreas Gruber, were now gripped by a profound collective terror. The murderer had not just killed, they had lingered. Evidence suggested that after the massacre, someone had remained at the farm for several days, feeding the livestock, eating meals, and even lighting fires in the stove. The perpetrator had lived amongst the dead, a chilling detail that twisted the knife of fear even deeper. The isolation of Hinterkaifeck, once a chosen sanctuary, had become its undoing. The cold, indifferent Bavarian woods held its secrets close, offering no witnesses, no solace, only the lingering echoes of an unspeakable crime. The unanswered questions began to multiply, each more disturbing than the last. Who had committed such an atrocity, and why? The silence of Hinterkaifeck now stretched beyond death, enveloping the truth in an impenetrable shroud. The discovery of the bodies was merely the beginning of a descent into a bureaucratic and psychological labyrinth. When the Munich police arrived, led by the legendary detective Georg Reingruber, they didn't find a cold crime scene. They found a house that felt lived in by death itself. The most disturbing realization was the timeline of the killer's residency. Evidence in the kitchen suggested that meals had been prepared and eaten days after the family had taken their final breaths. The bread was not yet moldy. The meat had been sliced recently. The chimney had continued to puff smoke, a cruel signal to the village that everything was fine, while 6 corpses lay stiffening in the barn and bedrooms. The autopsy, performed by court physician Dr. Johann Baptist Aumüller on the farm's own kitchen table, revealed a level of clinical brutality that defied logic. The weapon was confirmed to be a Ruthhaue, a heavy, cross-shaped mattock. But it was the condition of little Cecilia that haunted the investigators. She had survived the initial blow. Forensic evidence suggested that the 7-year-old girl lay in the straw for hours, perhaps even a day, tearing out tufts of her own hair in a fit of agonizing, solitary terror before finally succumbing to her wounds. The killer, moving through the house, would have heard her whimpers. He chose to let her fade away in the dark. The suspect list was a gallery of local grudges and dark secrets. First among them was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the man who discovered the bodies. His behavior was erratic. He moved the corpses before the police arrived, claiming he was looking for his son, Joseph. His intimate history with Victoria and a bitter dispute over alimony payments gave him a motive steeped in resentment. Yet the physical evidence was elusive. Then there were the rumors of the dead husband. Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, had reportedly died in the trenches of World War I, but his body was never recovered. Could a vengeful soldier, presumed dead, have returned to find his wife with another man's child? As the years bled into decades, the investigation grew cold, but the horror remained visceral. The heads of the victims were sent to Munich for clairvoyants to examine. A desperate, macabre attempt to use the supernatural to solve the inexplicable. The skulls were never returned and were lost during the chaos of World War II, leaving the headless bodies of the Gruber family to be buried in a lonely plot in Weidhofen. The farm at Hinterkaifeck was eventually demolished in 1923, a year after the massacre. The villagers couldn't bear the sight of it. The way the windows seemed to watch the road, the way the wind whistled through the attic where the intruder had once crouched. But even with the wood and stone cleared away, the ground remained heavy. Today, a simple stone shrine stands in the empty field, surrounded by the same haunting silence that preceded the screams. The case remains unsolved. No one was ever convicted. No one ever confessed. The identity of the shadow in the attic remains a void in the annals of criminal history. Hinterkaifeck endures not just as a murder mystery, but as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always knock at the door. Sometimes it climbs through the attic, watches you from the shadows for days, and waits for the snow to fall before it finally decides to let itself in.